The morning sun was just breaking over the Texas plains when Running Wolf and his war party spotted the smoke rising from the small homestead. It was autumn 1867, and tensions between the Comanche people and white settlers had reached a breaking point. Too many promises had been broken, too much land taken without payment, and too many of his people had gone hungry while settlers prospered. On what was once Comanche hunting grounds, Running Wolf had lived through 34 winters and had seen his world change in ways his grandfather never could have imagined. The buffalo herds were shrinking, pushed away by cattle and farms. The sacred places of his people were now marked with wooden posts and barbed wire. His own wife had died from a white man's disease the previous winter, along with their infant son, or so he had believed. The attack began at dawn, swift and decisive as Comanche raids always were. Running Wolf and 12 other warriors swept down on the Henderson place like autumn wind through tall grass. They expected to find the usual, maybe some horses to take, supplies they desperately needed, perhaps captives who could be traded back to the army for goods and safe passage. But what Running Wolf found inside the small wooden cabin stopped him cold. There, crouched in the corner behind an overturned table, was a young white woman with hair the color of prairie wheat. She couldn't have been more than 22 or 23 years old. Her dress was simple and worn, the kind poor settlers wore when they had little money for fine things. But it wasn't the woman that made Running Wolf's heart nearly stop beating. It was the child in her arms. The baby was crying, scared by the noise and shouting outside. The woman held him close to her chest, whispering soft words that Running Wolf couldn't understand but recognized as the universal language mothers use to comfort their children. As she turned slightly, trying to shield the baby from the warrior standing in her doorway, Running Wolf saw something that made his blood run cold and hot at the same time. On the child's left shoulder, just visible through his torn shirt, was a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon. Running Wolf knew that mark as well as he knew his own reflection. It was the same mark his son had carried, the same mark that ran in his family line for generations. His grandmother had always said it was a sign from the spirits marking those destined for great things. But his son was supposed to be dead. He had died with his mother during the sickness, hadn't he? Running Wolf's mind raced back to that terrible winter. The fever had taken so many, the old, the young, the strong, and the weak alike. Bodies had been wrapped quickly and taken away from the camp to prevent the sickness from spreading further. In his grief, he had barely looked at his son's small form before the burial ceremony. He had been too broken, too consumed with losing both his wife and child in the same week. Now, staring at this white woman holding a Comanche child with his family's sacred mark, Running Wolf realized what must have happened. During one of the chaotic days when the sickness was at its worst, someone had made a mistake. Perhaps his son had only appeared dead from the fever. Perhaps in the confusion another child had been buried in his place. Perhaps his son had been found by someone and taken away, eventually ending up here in this cabin, in the arms of a white woman who clearly loved him. The woman, he would later learn her name was Mary Beth, looked up at him with eyes that held no hatred, only fear for the child she protected. She didn't beg for her life or try to bargain. She just held the baby tighter and whispered something that sounded like a prayer. Running Wolf lowered his war club. Around him he could hear his warriors finishing their search of the property, taking what supplies they could find. Someone called out that they had found 2 horses in the small corral behind the cabin. Another reported that there seemed to be no men on the property, unusual for a working homestead. But Running Wolf couldn't move. He stood there looking at his son, alive, healthy, clearly well cared for, in the arms of someone who should have been his enemy. The child had grown since he last saw him. His black hair was longer now, his face rounder from good feeding. Someone had been taking very good care of him. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, part of a raiding party seeking revenge against the white settlers who had taken so much from his people, only to discover that one of those settlers had actually saved the most precious thing he had lost. One of his warriors, a young man called Swift Arrow, appeared in the doorway behind him. "Running Wolf, we should go. The horses are loaded and someone might have heard the noise." But Running Wolf held up his hand for patience. He looked again at the woman holding his son. She had been crying. He could see the tear tracks on her dusty cheeks, but she wasn't crying now. She was watching him with the alertness of a mother protecting her young, ready to fight or die if necessary. Slowly, carefully, Running Wolf knelt down so he wouldn't seem so threatening. He pointed to the child, then to his own chest, then back to the child. The universal language of family, of belonging. The woman's eyes widened as she began to understand what he was trying to tell her. She looked down at the child in her arms, the child she had been calling Thomas, after her late husband's father, and then back at the Comanche warrior kneeling before her. For a long moment, the only sound in the small cabin was the baby's soft breathing and the distant voices of the other warriors outside. Running Wolf could see the understanding dawning in her eyes. This wasn't just any raid, and this wasn't just any warrior. This was a father who had found his lost son. What happened next would change both their lives forever, though neither could have predicted it in that moment. The woman did something that surprised even Running Wolf. Instead of clutching the child tighter or trying to run, she slowly, carefully, extended the baby toward him, not as a surrender, but as an offering, as if to say, "If this is truly your son, then you should hold him." Running Wolf's hands shook as he reached out to take the child he had mourned for nearly a year. The moment his son was in his arms, he knew without any doubt. This was his boy. This was the child his wife had died protecting. This was the son he thought he had lost forever. The baby looked up at him with dark eyes that were unmistakably Comanche, unmistakably his own. And instead of crying or being afraid, the child reached up one small hand and touched Running Wolf's face, as if recognizing something familiar in the stranger who held him. Outside, Swift Arrow called again, more urgently this time. They really did need to leave. Other settlers might come to investigate, or the army patrol that had been seen in the area yesterday might return. But as Running Wolf looked from his son to the woman who had saved him, he knew this wasn't going to be as simple as just taking the child and riding away. This white woman had given his son life when his own people had failed to protect him. She had fed him, cared for him, loved him as her own. How could he simply take the child away from the only mother the boy had known for most of his short life? And how could he leave this woman alone and defenseless when she had done such a kindness even unknowingly, standing there in that small cabin, holding his son while the woman who had raised him watched with tears in her eyes? Running Wolf faced a choice that would test everything he believed about enemies, family, and what it truly meant to be a father. 3 days had passed since the raid, and Running Wolf had made a decision that shocked even his own warriors. Instead of taking his son and disappearing into the vastness of the plains, he had chosen to stay nearby. He needed to understand how his child had come to be in this woman's care, and more importantly, he needed to figure out what to do next. Mary Beth Wilson, that was her full name. He had learned through careful communication using a mix of broken English, sign language, and drawings scratched in the dirt with sticks, had agreed to tell him her story. She sat on the wooden steps of her small cabin, the baby playing contentedly between them with a corn husk doll she had made. The scene would have looked peaceful to any passing traveler, though no traveler would have expected to see a Comanche warrior and a white woman sharing such a quiet moment. The morning was still cool, with dew clinging to the prairie grass and the first hints of autumn coloring the leaves on the cottonwood trees near her small creek. Running Wolf sat cross-legged on the ground, his weapons laid aside but within easy reach, listening carefully as Mary Beth began to explain how she had come to be raising a Comanche child in the middle of Texas territory. Her story began 6 months earlier, during what the white people called the Troubles, a series of raids and counter-raids that had left both sides angry and grieving. Mary Beth had been married to a man named James Wilson, a former soldier-turned-farmer who had claimed a small piece of land near the Brazos River. They had been trying to start a family but had not been blessed with children of their own. James was a good man, Mary Beth said, her voice soft as she watched the baby explore a pile of smooth stones she had given him. He wasn't like some of the other settlers. He didn't hate your people just for being different. He said there was enough land in Texas for everyone if folks could just learn to share. Running Wolf listened carefully, though he had to concentrate to understand her accent and way of speaking. Her James sounded like one of the rare white men who understood that the Comanche weren't simply savage enemies to be destroyed, but people trying to protect their way of life. Such men were few in Running Wolf's experience. Most whites he had encountered seemed to believe that the only good Indian was a dead Indian, but understanding hadn't saved James Wilson. The trouble had started when a group of white men from a town, called Cedar Creek, had attacked a small Comanche hunting party, killing 2 young warriors who had been peacefully gathering buffalo meat for their families. The attack was unprovoked. The hunters had been on land that was supposed to be neutral territory according to the latest treaty that nobody seemed to remember or respect. Those boys weren't hurting anybody, Mary Beth continued, unconsciously echoing Running Wolf's thoughts. They were just trying to feed their people, same as any hunter would. But some folks in Cedar Creek had decided that any Indian was a threat, treaty or no treaty. The Comanche response had been swift and deadly, as it always was when their people were murdered without cause. A war party had struck several homesteads near Cedar Creek, taking horses and supplies and burning buildings. It wasn't random violence. It was justice by Comanche standards. Blood for blood, loss for loss, James. Wilson's farm hadn't been the primary target. It was just in the path of the warriors as they retreated back to safer territory after delivering their message to Cedar Creek. But when you're part of a war party seeking revenge, distinctions between guilty and innocent white settlers tend to blur. They came in the early morning, just like when you came, Mary Beth continued, her hands absently smoothing the baby's dark hair. But these warriors, they were angry. Angrier than I'd ever seen any human beings. James tried to talk to them, tried to explain that he wasn't part of what had happened at Cedar Creek. He spoke a little of your language, learned it from an old trapper who used to pass through here. Running Wolf could picture the scene. A desperate man trying to communicate with warriors whose hearts were hot with grief and rage, trying to explain in broken Comanche that he was innocent of the crimes that had brought death to his door. It was a conversation that probably lasted only minutes, but must have felt like hours to everyone involved. But anger doesn't always listen to reason, especially when it's the righteous anger of people who have lost family members to unprovoked attacks. The war party had been in no mood for lengthy discussions about individual guilt or innocence. They had come to send a message, and James Wilson's farm was part of that message, whether he deserved it or not. James died defending our cabin, Mary Beth said simply, her voice steady but her eyes reflecting old pain. He managed to wound one of his attackers before he fell. I always hoped that meant something to them, that he fought with honor even though he was outnumbered. Running Wolf nodded slightly. A man who fought bravely even in a hopeless situation earned respect from Comanche warriors. James Wilson would not have died unavenged if his killer had been dishonorable, but he would have died knowing that his enemies recognized his courage. The warriors had taken what they wanted from the small homestead, horses, tools, food supplies, anything that would be useful back at their camp, and then left, assuming that the woman inside would either die or flee back to the safety of a larger settlement. Isolated frontier wives rarely survived long without their husband's protection. They hadn't bothered to search the root cellar. I hid down there for 2 days, Mary Beth said, pointing to a wooden door set into the ground near the side of the cabin. Too scared to come out, too scared to stay. I could hear things moving around up here, animals maybe. Or maybe some of the warriors coming back to see if they'd missed anything valuable. The root cellar was small and dark, barely large enough for one person to crouch in among the stored potatoes and preserved meat. Mary Beth had huddled there with her husband's rifle, jumping at every sound, trying to decide whether it was safer to emerge or to wait until she either starved or went mad from fear and isolation. When I finally did come up, I thought I was alone in the world, she continued. Everything we'd built together was gone or destroyed. James was dead. The horses were gone. Half our supplies were taken. I didn't know how I was going to survive, or even if I wanted to try, but she wasn't alone. On her second day out of hiding, while she was trying to dig a grave for her husband with her bare hands and a broken shovel, the raiders had taken or damaged most of the tools. She heard crying coming from the woods behind her property. At first, she thought it might be an injured animal, maybe a coyote pup separated from its pack. But the sound was too regular, too human. Following the sound through the trees and underbrush, she found a small bundle wrapped in buffalo hide, tucked carefully beneath an overhanging rock formation that provided some shelter from rain and wind. The placement was deliberate. Someone had chosen this spot specifically to protect whatever was hidden there. Inside the bundle was a baby boy, maybe 4 or 5 months old, burning with fever and barely alive. I thought he was a settler's child at first, Mary Beth admitted, looking at Running Wolf with honest eyes. Thought maybe some family had been attacked and the mother had hidden him, just like I hid in the cellar. It never occurred to me that he might be Comanche. I'd never seen a Comanche baby before, and when they're that young, children pretty much all look the same. The infant was in terrible condition. His skin was hot and dry with fever. His breathing was shallow and irregular, and he was so weak he could barely cry. Someone had wrapped him carefully in soft buffalo hide with a few basic supplies: a small gourd for water, some dried meat that had already been chewed soft for feeding to a baby, a few roots that Mary Beth didn't recognize but that might have been medicine. Whoever had left him there had clearly hoped someone would find him and care for him. But they had also clearly been desperate. No parent abandons a sick child unless all other options have been exhausted. "I thought he was going to die right there in my arms," Mary Beth said, her voice reflecting the memory of that desperate day. He was so still, so quiet. I'd never had a baby of my own, but I knew enough to recognize that he was in serious trouble. She had taken the dying infant back to her cabin and fought for his life with everything she had. She had no milk of her own to give him, so she had mixed water with the small amount of flour she had left, creating a thin gruel that she fed him drop by drop with a wooden spoon. When he was too weak to swallow, she dribbled water into his mouth and massaged his tiny throat to help him get it down. The fever had been the worst part. For 5 days and nights she had sat by the fire holding him, keeping his small body warm while trying to cool the burning heat that seemed to be consuming him from within. She had stripped him down and bathed him with cool water when his temperature spiked too high. She had wrapped him in blankets when chills racked his tiny frame. "I'd never prayed so hard in my life," Mary Beth said. "I kept thinking, this child has already lost everything. His family, his home, maybe his whole way of life. The least I can do is make sure he doesn't die alone and unloved." She had sung to him during those long, frightening nights. Lullabies her own mother had sung to her when she was small. The first sign Mary Beth had that something had changed came on a cold October morning when she found a freshly killed deer hanging from the oak tree behind her cabin. The animal had been expertly cleaned and prepared, with cuts that showed whoever had done the work knew exactly how to preserve the meat for the coming winter. She stood there in her worn woolen shawl, breath visible in the crisp morning air, staring at the unexpected gift. The deer was still warm, which meant it had been killed and prepared just before dawn. Someone had worked in the darkness, moving silently around her property while she and Thomas slept peacefully inside the cabin. Mary Beth looked around nervously, scanning the tree line and the rolling hills beyond her small property, but saw no sign of who might have left such a generous present. Her late husband's rifle was kept loaded and ready by the front door, but somehow she didn't feel the need to reach for it. There was something about the way the deer had been left, carefully hung at just the right height for her to manage. With respect for the animal and consideration for her ability to handle the heavy carcass, that suggested kindness rather than threat. 2 days later, she found rabbit tracks leading right to her root cellar door. Inside, 3 fat rabbits had been cleaned and prepared, wrapped in large leaves to keep the meat fresh and cool. Again, no sign of the hunter, but the same careful attention to making sure the meat would keep well and be easy for her to cook. Thomas, now walking with increasing confidence, pointed at the rabbits and babbled something that sounded almost like words. He seemed more curious than frightened by these mysterious appearances of food, as if he somehow understood that whoever was providing for them meant no harm. By the third gift, a collection of edible roots and wild herbs that Mary Beth recognized as both nutritious and medicinal, she was certain she knew who her mysterious benefactor was. Only someone with deep knowledge of the land and its resources could have found such perfect provisions. Only someone who had watched her carefully would know exactly what she needed most as winter approached. Running Wolf was still nearby, and he was taking care of them. The realization should have frightened her more than it did. Everything she had been taught about Comanche warriors said they were dangerous, unpredictable, violent people who couldn't be trusted around white settlers. The stories told in towns and around campfires painted them as savage enemies who showed no mercy and honored no agreements, but her own experience was telling her something very different. This warrior, the father of the child she had been raising as her own son, was showing her a kindness that went beyond simple gratitude. He was making sure they had enough food for winter, ensuring they were safe and protected without asking for anything in return. He was acting less like a savage enemy and more like like family. The first time she actually saw him after that dramatic day in her cabin, it was early November, and the first frost was beginning to settle on the grass each morning. Thomas was playing in the small, fenced area beside the cabin while she hung laundry. On a rope line James had strung between two posts before his death, she looked up from hanging one of Thomas's small shirts, sewn from the fabric of one of her own dresses. And there he was, standing at the edge of the clearing about 30 yards away. He made no attempt to hide himself, but he also didn't come any closer. He was simply watching his son play, with an expression on his weathered face that Mary Beth recognized. Immediately, it was the same expression she wore when she watched Thomas learning something new or achieving some small milestone, taking his first steps, saying a new word, figuring out how to stack his wooden blocks just right. It was the look of a parent who had missed too much already and was trying to memorize every precious moment. Running Wolf stood perfectly still among the trees, dressed in buckskin and fur against the growing cold. His long black hair moved slightly in the autumn breeze, and Mary Beth could see the careful way he positioned himself, close enough to see his son clearly, far enough away to avoid startling or threatening them. Slowly, carefully, Mary Beth picked up Thomas and walked halfway across the clearing. Then she sat down on a fallen log that James had left there the previous spring, intending to chop it up for firewood but never finding the time. She settled the baby on her lap, facing toward where his father stood, and didn't say anything, didn't wave or call out. She just sat there, letting Running Wolf see his son clearly, letting the child get used to the presence of this tall, still figure at the edge of their world. Thomas, being barely a year old, was more interested in the bright red leaves that were falling from the trees than in the man watching him from the forest. But after a few minutes, he did turn his head and look curiously toward Running Wolf. The baby didn't cry or seem frightened. If anything, he seemed intrigued by this new element in their daily routine. "That's your papa," Mary Beth said softly, knowing Running Wolf could probably hear her voice carrying in the still air. "He's come to see how you're growing." Thomas babbled something in response and clapped his small hands as if he understood that this was someone important. Children at that age, Mary Beth had noticed, seemed to have an instinct for recognizing people who cared about them, even strangers. They sat that way for perhaps 20 minutes, the three of them forming an odd triangle in the autumn afternoon. The air smelled of wood smoke from Mary Beth's chimney and the earthy scent of fallen leaves. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk called out as it hunted over the prairie. It was peaceful in a way that Mary Beth hadn't experienced since before James's death. Then Running Wolf raised one hand in what Mary Beth recognized as a peaceful gesture, palm open, no weapons visible, turned, and disappeared back into the woods as silently as he had appeared. The next day, he was there again. This time he came a little closer, maybe 20 yards instead of 30. And this time, Mary Beth spoke to him directly. His first word was "Mama," she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. But his second word was "horse." He loves watching the horses in the corral. The two horses James had been trying to break before his death still lived in the small enclosure behind the cabin. They were calmer now than they had been in the immediate aftermath of the raid, though Mary Beth couldn't quite figure out why. They seemed more willing to let her approach them, more responsive to her voice when she brought them hay and water. Running Wolf said nothing in response to her comment about Thomas's first words, but she saw him nod slightly, as if filing away this information about his son's development and interests. "He's starting to pull himself up on things," she continued, bouncing Thomas gently on her knee. "Won't be long before he's walking everywhere. James always said babies who walked early were going to be wanderers, always looking for new places to explore." Again, that small nod of acknowledgement. Running Wolf was listening, learning about his son's personality and progress from the woman who saw him every day. This pattern continued for weeks. Running Wolf would appear at the edge of the clearing, usually in the late afternoon when the light was soft and golden. Mary Beth would bring Thomas outside and talk to the child's father about small things, what the baby had eaten that day, funny things he had done, new sounds he was making as he learned to communicate. She told him about Thomas's favorite games, about how he liked to bang wooden spoons against pots and pans, about how he would laugh when she made silly faces at him. She described his eating habits, his sleeping patterns, his reactions to different sounds and sights around the homestead. "He's not afraid of thunder," she reported one afternoon after a brief autumn storm had passed through. Most babies cry when it gets loud like that. But Thomas just listens like he's trying to figure out where the sound comes from. Comanche children learn early that loud noises are not always dangerous, Running Wolf replied, speaking for the first time in their daily encounters. His English was careful but clear, with the accent that came from learning a language as an adult. We do not raise our children to fear what they do not understand. It was a simple exchange, but it represented a breakthrough. They were having a conversation now, not just Mary Beth talking to a silent observer. They were sharing information about Thomas's upbringing, comparing their different approaches to raising children. Gradually, as autumn deepened into the first hints of winter, their conversations became longer and more meaningful. Mary Beth began to pick up some basic Comanche words that Running Wolf taught her. Words for family relationships, for common objects around the homestead, for emotions and actions that related to child rearing. In my people's way, he told her one afternoon in late November, a child this age would be learning to ride. We put babies on gentle horses almost as soon as they can sit up steady. Mary Beth looked down at Thomas, who was indeed sitting steadily on his own now, his dark eyes alert and curious as always. The horses here are too big for him, she said, and too wild. James never finished breaking them properly before. She didn't finish the sentence, but Running Wolf understood. Her husband's death had left many tasks unfinished, including the training of the 2 horses that still lived in her small corral. The animals were half-broken at best. Spring brought more than just wildflowers and warming weather to the Texas plains. It brought complications that would test everything Running Wolf and Mary Beth had built during their quiet winter together. The first sign of trouble came in late March, when Mary Beth spotted a dust cloud on the horizon that meant riders were coming fast. She had learned to read the signs of approaching danger during her months alone on the frontier. The way birds scattered from their perches, the nervous behavior of her horses, the particular quality of dust that meant armed men rather than peaceful travelers. She grabbed Thomas, now walking steadily and getting into everything with the boundless curiosity of a healthy toddler, and hurried inside the cabin to watch through the single window that faced the main approach to her property. Her heart pounded as she counted the riders, 5 men wearing the blue uniforms and weathered expressions of cavalry soldiers. Thomas sensed her tension and pressed against her legs, his dark eyes wide with concern. At 16 months old, he was old enough to pick up on adult emotions even when he didn't understand their cause. Mary Beth picked him up and held him close, as much for her own comfort as for his. The soldiers rode into her yard with the careful movements of men who had seen too much frontier violence to take chances with unknown situations. Their leader, a sergeant with graying hair and tired eyes, dismounted and approached her door with his hand resting on his sidearm. Not threatening, but ready. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "I'm Sergeant Mitchell with the 4th Cavalry. We need to ask you some questions about activity in this area." Mary Beth took a deep breath and opened the door, keeping Thomas on her hip where she could protect him if necessary. The morning air was crisp and clean, but she could smell the dust and sweat of hard travel on the soldiers and their horses. "What can I help you with, Sergeant?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady and normal despite the fear that was making her hands shake slightly. "We've had reports of Comanche activity in this area," Mitchell said, his experienced eyes scanning her property for signs of trouble or deception. "Unusual activity. Some of the other settlers say they've seen smoke from your direction during times when there shouldn't be anyone here but you and the child." Mary Beth's mind raced. The smoke had probably come from the larger fires Running Wolf made when he was preparing meat for storage, or from the times he had helped her with heavier work around the property that required more heat than her small cooking fire could provide. How could she explain that without revealing everything about their arrangement? "I've been managing fine on my own," she said carefully, bouncing Thomas gently when he began to fuss at the sight of strangers. "Sometimes I need bigger fires for washing clothes or cooking large batches of food to preserve for later." One of the other soldiers, younger and more suspicious than his sergeant, spoke up from where he sat on his horse. "What about the horses, ma'am?" "Word is they're a lot calmer than they used to be. Your husband never got them properly broken before he died, according to folks who knew him." This was dangerous territory. Mary Beth could feel Thomas growing more restless in her arms, picking up on the tension in the air even though he was too young to understand the conversation taking place around him. "I've been working with them myself," she said, hoping her voice sounded more confident than she felt. Animals calm down when they're treated kindly and given consistent care. James always said patience was more important than force when it came to training horses. Sergeant Mitchell stepped closer to the porch, and Mary Beth could see he wasn't entirely convinced by her explanations. His eyes were sharp and intelligent, the kind that came from years of dealing with people who had reasons to lie to cavalry officers. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you directly," he said, his tone becoming more serious. "Have you had any contact with Comanche warriors? Any contact at all, even if you thought it was harmless?" The moment of truth had arrived sooner than Mary Beth had hoped. She looked down at Thomas, who was peeking around her arm to stare at the uniformed strangers with the wide-eyed curiosity that characterized everything he did. Those eyes that were unmistakably Comanche, that would give away his heritage to anyone who looked closely enough and knew what to look for. "Sergeant," she said slowly, making a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable, "I think you should know that I've been raising a child who isn't mine by blood." Mitchell's expression sharpened immediately, and she could see the other soldiers shifting in their saddles, suddenly more alert and focused on her every word. "What kind of child?" Mitchell asked, though his tone suggested he was already beginning to guess the answer. Before Mary Beth could respond, Thomas chose that moment to babble something in the mixture of English and Comanche he had been learning from both his parents during the long winter months. The sound of Comanche words coming from the toddler made all 5 soldiers tense up visibly, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. "That's a Comanche child," the young soldier said, his voice tight with suspicion and barely controlled anger. "Ma'am, what's a Comanche child doing in your cabin? How long has he been here?" Mary Beth felt a surge of protective anger at the hostile tone the soldier used when talking about Thomas. This was her son they were discussing, not some dangerous enemy to be feared and despised. "I found him nearly dead from fever 10 months ago," she said, lifting her chin with the pride of someone who knew she had done the right thing regardless of what others might think. "I nursed him back to health, and I've been raising him as my own son ever since. His name is Thomas, and he's a good, sweet child who has never hurt anyone." "His name," said a new voice from the edge of the clearing, calm and clear in the tense morning air, "is also Little Bear." All 6 adults turned to see Running Wolf emerging from the tree line where he had been watching and waiting. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man on his own territory, armed but non-threatening, his presence a statement rather than a challenge. Mary Beth felt a complex mix of relief and terror. Relief because she was no longer facing this confrontation alone. Terror because the situation had just become infinitely more dangerous for everyone involved. "Comanche warrior," the young soldier shouted, his hand moving to his sidearm with the speed of someone trained to react first and ask questions later. "Wait!" Mary Beth stepped forward instinctively, placing herself between the drawn guns and Running Wolf, her body shielding Thomas from potential crossfire. "Wait, please. He's not here to fight anyone. Ma'am, get away from him right now," Sergeant Mitchell ordered, his own weapon now drawn and pointed at Running Wolf. "That's a hostile Indian and you're in immediate danger." "No," Mary Beth said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her own voice. "I'm not in danger from him. He's Thomas's father, and he's been helping us survive the winter. He's been nothing but kind and honorable to both of us." The silence that followed was tense enough to cut with a knife. Thomas, frightened by all the shouting and the sight of drawn weapons, began to cry. Without thinking about the soldiers or their guns, Mary Beth shifted him to her shoulder and patted his back soothingly, while Running Wolf took a careful step forward, his own concern for his son clear on his weathered face. "You've been harboring a Comanche warrior," Mitchell said slowly, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "A member of a hostile tribe that's been raiding settlements across this territory for months. I've been living peacefully with the father of my child," Mary Beth corrected him, her voice growing stronger as her initial fear gave way to determined protectiveness. "A man who saved our lives when he could have taken revenge for his own losses. A man who has shown me more honor and respect than many white men I've known." Running Wolf spoke then, his English careful but clear, carrying the dignity of someone who refused to be intimidated despite being outnumbered and outgunned. "I am Running Wolf of the Noconi Band," he said, meeting Mitchell's eyes directly. "This is my son, taken from our camp during the sick time last winter. This woman saved his life when my people could not. She has cared for him with love and devotion. I owe her a debt that can never be fully repaid." "The only debt here," the young soldier said, his gun still trained on Running Wolf, is what you owe for the settlers your people have killed and the property you've stolen. You should be on a reservation where you belong, not threatening innocent women and children. And what debt do your people owe? Running Wolf replied, his voice level but carrying an edge of steel. For the treaties broken and the promises forgotten? For the hunting grounds taken without payment? For the sickness brought to my people and the children who died because white men would not honor their agreements? That's enough, Sergeant Mitchell said. But he didn't sound as certain as he had moments before. Mary Beth could see him processing what he was hearing, trying to fit this situation into the simple categories of good and evil, civilized and savage that the Army preferred to work with. Sergeant, Mary Beth said, continuing to bounce Thomas gently to quiet his crying, what if I told you that this man has never harmed me or threatened me in any way? That he's been protecting us and providing for us through the worst winter I've ever faced? The warning from Sergeant Mitchell proved prophetic sooner than anyone expected. Less than 2 weeks after the cavalry visit, Mary Beth woke to the sound of multiple horses approaching her cabin in the pre-dawn darkness. This time, however, it wasn't soldiers who had come calling. She peered through the small window beside her bed and felt her blood turn cold. Standing in her yard were 4 men from Cedar Creek, the same town whose residents had started the cycle of violence that had killed her husband months earlier. She recognized their leader immediately, Benjamin Crawford, a wealthy rancher who owned most of the land around the growing settlement and had strong opinions about how the Indian problem should be solved permanently. Crawford was a big man with cold gray eyes and the kind of confidence that came from never being told no by anyone who mattered. He sat his horse like a man who owned whatever ground he chose to stand on. The 3 men with him were cut from the same cloth, hard, suspicious, and armed with both guns and prejudices that ran as deep as the roots of the prairie grass. Mary Beth quickly pulled on her dress and checked on Thomas, who was still sleeping peacefully in his small bed. The boy had learned to sleep through most disturbances, a skill that had served him well during his months of living between 2 worlds, but she could see him beginning to stir at the sound of harsh voices. "Outside, Mrs. Wilson," Crawford called out, not bothering to dismount from his horse or show any of the courtesy usually expected when visiting a woman's home. "We need to have a conversation with you." Mary Beth stepped out onto her small porch, pulling a shawl around her shoulders against the morning chill. The air smelled of frost and wood smoke, and she could see her breath in small puffs as she spoke. "What can I do for you, Mr. Crawford?" she asked, though her tone made it clear. She suspected this wasn't a social visit or a neighborly check on her welfare. "You can start by explaining why cavalry soldiers are telling folks in town that you've been living with a Comanche warrior," Crawford said, his voice carrying accusation like a weapon. "You can explain why there's a half-breed child in your cabin and why you've been providing aid and comfort to our enemies." The words hit Mary Beth like physical blows. Half-breed, enemies, aid and comfort. Each phrase was chosen to wound, to reduce everything she had built with Running Wolf and Thomas to something ugly and shameful. She felt anger rising in her chest, hot and protective. "I've been raising a child who needed care," she said, working to keep her voice steady despite the insult to her son. "And I've been living peacefully on my own land, bothering nobody and asking nothing from anyone." "Peacefully," Crawford repeated, as if the word left a bad taste in his mouth. "Lady, there's nothing peaceful about consorting with the savages who killed your husband. There's nothing peaceful about raising a Comanche child who'll grow up to raid and murder innocent white settlers, just like his father before him." One of Crawford's companions, a thin man with nervous eyes and tobacco-stained teeth, leaned forward in his saddle. "Folks in town are saying you've been helping that warrior plan attacks against other homesteads, saying you're feeding him information about when settlements are most vulnerable to raids." The accusation was so absurd that Mary Beth almost laughed, despite the seriousness of the situation. "Information about what?" "I haven't left this property in months, and I don't know anything about other settlements that would help anyone plan anything. I barely know what's happening beyond my own fence line." "But you admit you've been helping him," Crawford pressed, his eyes narrowing with the satisfaction of someone who thought he had trapped his opponent in a contradiction. "You admit you've been feeding and sheltering a hostile Indian who should be on a reservation where he belongs, not roaming free to terrorize decent Christian families." Mary Beth felt a flash of anger that surprised her with its intensity. These men had ridden onto her property before dawn to threaten and intimidate her, Yet they had the nerve to lecture her about Christian behavior and decency. "I've been helping the father of my child." "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "A man who has shown me nothing but kindness and respect. A man who has worked harder to keep us safe and fed than anyone from Cedar Creek ever has or ever will." "Your child," Crawford said, and there was something in his voice that made Mary Beth's blood run cold with fear. "Let's talk about that, because from what I hear, that child isn't yours by birth or by law. That child is a Comanche, and under territorial regulations. Comanche children are supposed to be taken to reservation schools where they can be properly educated and civilized." "He's just a baby," Mary Beth protested, her voice breaking slightly. "He's barely walking. He's not a threat to anyone. He's never hurt a soul in his short life." "He's a future warrior," the thin man said with conviction. "They all are. You keep him here, learning savage ways and growing up thinking he's got a right to live among white people. And in 15 years he'll be leading raids against the very settlements that should have taken him in and civilized him when they had the chance." "His father doesn't raid settlements," Mary Beth said hotly, her protective instincts overriding her caution. "His father hunts and provides for his family and minds his own business. He's never attacked anyone who didn't attack him first. His father," Crawford said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet that made Mary Beth's skin crawl, "is a Comanche warrior, and that means he's killed white people, whether you want to admit it or not. That means he's an enemy of civilization and progress and everything we're trying to build in this territory, and that means any white woman who helps him is a traitor to her own kind." The word hung in the air between them like a curse. Traitor. Mary Beth had heard it, whispered behind her back during her few trips to town for supplies, had seen it in the suspicious looks of neighbors who had once been friendly, but no one had said it to her face until now. "I'm not a traitor to anything or anyone," she said, lifting her chin with the same pride she had shown the cavalry soldiers. "I'm a woman who chose to save a dying child instead of letting him die alone in the wilderness. I'm a woman who chose to see past skin color and blood feuds to recognize honor and kindness where I found it." Crawford dismounted now, his boots hitting the ground with deliberate force that was meant to intimidate. He was a big man, used to using his size and presence to get his way, and he clearly expected Mary Beth to back down in the face of his physical dominance. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, stepping closer to the porch where she stood, "I'm going to give you one chance to do the right thing here. One chance to prove you're still a loyal American and a decent Christian woman who understands her duties to her own people." "And what would that be?" Mary Beth asked, though she dreaded hearing the answer. "You're going to tell us where that warrior is camped," Crawford said with the confidence of a man who expected immediate obedience. "You're going to help us track him down so we can deal with him properly, the way we should have dealt with his kind years ago. And you're going to surrender that Comanche child to proper authorities who can see he gets raised right, in a Christian home where he can learn civilized ways." Mary Beth felt the world tilt around her as the full scope of what they were asking hit her. They weren't just asking her to betray Running Wolf. They were asking her to give up Thomas, to hand over the child she had raised from near death to people who saw him as nothing more than a future enemy to be dealt with before he could become a threat. "I won't do that," she said quietly, but with absolute conviction. "Won't do what exactly?" Crawford pressed, stepping even closer to the porch in a clear attempt to intimidate her. "Any of it," Mary Beth said, her voice growing stronger as her resolve hardened. "I won't tell you where to find Running Wolf, and I won't give you Thomas. He's my son regardless of who gave birth to him, and I won't hand him over to people who see him as an enemy, instead of a child who deserves love and protection." The silence that followed was thick with threat and barely controlled violence. Crawford's 3 companions were watching their leader carefully, waiting for some signal about how far they were prepared to push this confrontation. "Mrs. Wilson," Crawford said slowly, his voice carrying unmistakable menace, "I don't think you understand the position you're in here. You're a woman alone on an isolated homestead, protecting enemies of the territory and defying the will of decent law-abiding citizens. There's no law out here that would protect you if something unfortunate were to happen to you, and that half-breed child you're so determined to defend." It was as clear a threat as Mary Beth had ever heard, but instead of frightening her into submission, it made her angrier than she had ever been in her life. These men were threatening her and her child in the name of civilization and justice. while the savage they wanted to hunt down had never offered her anything but protection and respect. "Mr. Crawford," she said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her, "if you're planning to threaten a woman and child to get what you want, then maybe you should ask yourself who the real savage is in this situation." Crawford's face darkened with rage at her defiance, but before he could respond with either words or actions, a new voice cut through the tension like a knife through silk. The confrontation with Crawford's men changed everything, though not in ways that were immediately obvious. For 3 days after the threats and harsh words, life at the small homestead seemed almost normal on the surface. Thomas continued to chase butterflies and practice his increasingly confident toddler steps between his two parents. Mary Beth continued her daily routines of cooking, cleaning, and tending the small garden behind the cabin that was beginning to show the first green shoots of spring. Running Wolf continued to hunt and provide, to teach his son Comanche words, and to help with the endless tasks that frontier life demanded. But underneath the surface normalcy, all the adults, Running Wolf, Mary Beth, and the warriors who had taken to camping in the nearby woods for protection, knew that time was running out. The peaceful winter they had shared was ending, and the larger world was closing in on them with expectations and demands that could no longer be ignored or postponed. The decision came to a head on a warm May evening when Swift Arrow, Running Wolf's closest friend among his band, arrived with news that no one wanted to hear but everyone had been expecting. "The elders have made their choice about summer grounds," Swift Arrow announced, settling by the small fire that Running Wolf had built outside the cabin. His weathered face was serious, and Mary Beth could tell from his tone that whatever he had to say would change their lives forever. "We move north in 4 days, to the land near the Canadian River where the buffalo herds are said to be thick this year," he continued in Comanche, though Mary Beth had learned enough of the language during the winter months to understand the basic meaning of his words. Running Wolf nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting this news but still dreaded hearing it confirmed. The seasonal movements of the Comanche bands followed patterns that had been established for generations, driven by the need to follow game animals and find the best grazing for their horse herds. "How far north?" Running Wolf asked, though Mary Beth could see in his expression that he already knew the answer wouldn't be good news for their unusual family arrangement. 6 days' ride, maybe 7 with the whole band moving together and the older people who cannot travel as fast as they once could, Swift Arrow replied. "Too far for a man to travel back and forth easily. Too far for a warrior to fulfill his duties to his people while spending time elsewhere." The unspoken message was clear to everyone listening. If Running Wolf chose to go with his band to the summer hunting grounds, he would have to take Thomas with him or risk not seeing his son for months at a time. The boy was old enough now to travel safely, old enough to begin learning the ways of his father's people in earnest. But taking Thomas would mean separating him from Mary Beth, the only mother he had ever known. It would mean taking him from the cabin where he had learned to walk, from the simple wooden toys she had carved for him, from the songs she sang to him at bedtime, from everything that represented security and love in his young world. "There is more news," Swift Arrow continued, his voice heavy with reluctance to deliver additional bad tidings. "Word has reached the band about your situation here, about the white woman and the threats from her people. Some of the elders are concerned about what this means for the band's safety." "Concerned about what exactly?" Running Wolf asked, though his tone suggested he could guess what was coming. "They worry that staying here makes you vulnerable to attack from angry white settlers," Swift Arrow explained. "They worry that bringing conflict with white communities could endanger the whole band if soldiers decide to retaliate against all Comanche for the actions of one warrior. And they worry." Swift Arrow paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he had to say next. "They worry about the boy growing up between two worlds, belonging fully to neither," he finished. "They fear he will be confused about his identity, weak in his loyalty to his people, unable to be a proper Comanche warrior when the time comes for him to take his place among the men." Mary Beth didn't need a detailed translation to understand the gist of this conversation. She had been learning to read the expressions and tones that accompanied Comanche discussions, and she could see the weight of tribal expectation settling on Running Wolf's shoulders, like a heavy blanket that threatened to smother the life they had built together. That night, after Swift Arrow had returned to the temporary camp, where the other warriors waited for Running Wolf's decision, The unlikely family sat outside the cabin under a canopy of stars that seemed brighter and more numerous than they ever had during the long winter months. Thomas slept peacefully inside the cabin, exhausted from a day of exploring and playing, but the two adults found no peace in the soft spring evening. The air was warm and fragrant with the smell of wildflowers, filled with the sounds of night birds and the distant howl of a coyote, but neither Mary Beth nor Running Wolf felt at ease. "They want you to take him and go?" Mary Beth said quietly. It wasn't a question, because the answer was written clearly in Running Wolf's troubled expression. "They want me to fulfill my responsibilities as a father and as a member of the band," Running Wolf replied carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone trying to be completely honest without causing unnecessary pain. "They want Thomas to grow up knowing his heritage, learning the skills he will need to survive in the world that is coming." "And what do you want?" Mary Beth asked, though she wasn't sure she was ready to hear the answer. Running Wolf was quiet for a long time, staring up at the stars that seemed so much brighter out here in the vast Texas sky than they ever had when he was traveling with war parties or hunting with his band. The night sky had always been a source of comfort to him, a reminder that some things remained constant even when everything else in the world seemed to be changing too fast to understand. "I want what is best for my son," he said finally, "but I am no longer certain what that is. The world has become complicated in ways my father never had to face." Mary Beth understood his confusion better than he might have expected. Over the winter months, she had been thinking about Thomas's future constantly, wondering how a child caught between two worlds could ever find his place in either one, wondering what kind of life he would have as he grew up different from everyone around him. "Tell me about your people's way of raising children," she said. "Tell me what he would learn if he went with you to the summer grounds and beyond." Running Wolf seemed surprised by the request, but he began to describe the childhood he had experienced and the one he had always expected to provide for his own son. Thomas would learn to ride almost before he could walk properly, spending hours each day on horseback until sitting a horse became as natural as walking on his own 2 feet. He would learn to track animals by reading the stories their footprints told in mud and sand, to understand weather patterns by watching the behavior of birds and the color of clouds, to move silently through tall grass and thick woods without disturbing the world around him. He would learn the stories of his people, tales of brave warriors and wise chiefs, of the time when buffalo covered the plains like a dark sea that stretched beyond the horizon, of the sacred places where the spirits of their ancestors still watched over the living. He would learn the songs that connected him to generations of his family, the ceremonies that marked important passages in a man's life, the responsibilities that came with being a member of the tribe. He would learn to be Comanche, Running Wolf concluded. He would know who he is and where he comes from. He would understand his place in the great circle of life that connects all living things. "And if he stays here with me?" Mary Beth asked, though she suspected she already knew what Running Wolf would say. "He would learn to read and write in English," Running Wolf said, thinking through the implications carefully. "He would understand the white man's laws and ways of doing business. He would be able to move in both worlds when he grows older, perhaps to serve as a bridge between our peoples when the time comes for treaties and negotiations. But he wouldn't truly know his father," Mary Beth said softly. "He wouldn't understand the heritage that flows in his blood. And if he comes with me, he would not know his mother," Running Wolf replied with equal sadness. "He would not understand the kindness and love that saved his life when his own people failed to protect him." They sat in silence for a while, both of them recognizing that they were facing an impossible choice. Every option seemed to require sacrificing something essential to Thomas's well-being and happiness. No matter what they decided, their son would lose half of himself. "There might be another way," Mary Beth said eventually, her voice tentative as if she were afraid to voice the idea that had been growing in her mind during the long winter months. "What way is that?" Running Wolf asked, leaning forward with interest. Mary Beth took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to suggest would sound impossible to anyone who heard it, white or Comanche. It went against every tradition and expectation of both their peoples. "What if we didn't choose?" she said slowly. "What if we found a way for him to have both worlds instead of being forced to pick just one?" Running Wolf turned to look at her more directly, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering light from the dying fire. "I don't understand what you mean." The first test of their unprecedented arrangement came sooner than either Running Wolf or Mary Beth had expected. 3 weeks after they had made their decision to share Thomas's upbringing between two worlds, Swift Arrow returned with news that the band could wait no longer. They had to move to the summer hunting grounds immediately, or risk losing their chance at the buffalo herds that would sustain them through the coming year. Standing in the small cabin that had become their unlikely home for the past months, the three adults faced the reality of what their decision truly meant. Thomas, now walking confidently and chattering in his mixture of English and Comanche, played happily with a wooden horse Running Wolf had carved for him, completely unaware that his world was about to change dramatically. The morning air was fresh with the scent of prairie grass and wildflowers, but Mary Beth felt as if she couldn't breathe properly. Her hand shook slightly as she began packing Thomas's few belongings, the clothes she had sewn for him from scraps of her own dresses, the cornhusk doll he loved to carry around, a small blanket that had been his comfort during the long winter nights when fever or bad dreams disturbed his sleep. "He is very young for traveling such distances," Mary Beth said, trying to keep the worry and heartbreak out of her voice. "He's not even 2 years old yet. What if something happens to him on the trail?" "Comanche children travel from the time they can sit up in their mother's arms," Running Wolf replied gently, his own voice reflecting the difficulty of this separation. "He will ride with me safe and secure, and the journey will become an adventure for him, not a hardship. The other children in the band will help him learn and feel welcome." Mary Beth nodded, but her throat felt tight and her eyes burned with tears. She was trying not to shed in front of Thomas. The boy was too young to understand what was happening, but children his age were sensitive to adult emotions, and she didn't want to frighten him with her own sadness. "How long?" she asked quietly, though they had discussed this many times already. 4 moons, Running Wolf said, using the Comanche measure of time that had become familiar to her during their winter together. "We will return when the leaves begin to change color, before the cold weather settles in for another winter. 4 months. It seemed like an eternity to a woman who had barely been separated from the child for more than a few hours, since she had found him dying in the wilderness. But she had made a promise, and she intended to keep it, no matter how much it hurt to watch her son leave with his father. The morning of departure was harder than either parent had anticipated. Thomas, sensing the emotion in the air but not understanding its source, became fussy and clingy, alternating between reaching for Mary Beth and trying to climb into Running Wolf's arms. The child's confusion and distress started both adults crying as well, though they tried to hide their tears from each other and from the boy. "Mama come?" Thomas asked in his sweet toddler voice, reaching back toward Mary Beth as Running Wolf prepared to lift him onto his horse. The question broke Mary Beth's heart into pieces she wasn't sure could ever be put back together. "Mama will be here when you come back," Mary Beth managed to say, her voice barely steady enough to get the words out. "Papa is going to show you the big buffalo and teach you to ride horses like a brave warrior. You'll have wonderful adventures with your Comanche family, and then you'll come home and tell me all about everything you learned." Running Wolf had fashioned a small saddle that would keep Thomas secure in front of him during the long ride north. As he settled his son into position, he leaned down from his horse to speak quietly to Mary Beth. "I will protect him with my life," he promised, his own voice thick with emotion, "and I will bring him back to you healthy and happy, full of stories about his time with his father's people." "I know you will," Mary Beth replied, reaching up to touch Thomas's small hand one last time. The boy's fingers were warm and soft, and she tried to memorize the feeling, knowing it would have to sustain her through the long months ahead. "Take care of each other," she whispered. As the small group of riders disappeared into the morning haze, Mary Beth stood in her yard feeling more alone than she had since those first terrible days after her husband's death. The cabin seemed impossibly quiet without Thomas's laughter and constant chatter. The toys scattered around the main room looked abandoned and forlorn, as if they were waiting for their owner to return and bring them back to life. But she had work to do. If this arrangement was going to succeed, she needed to use the time alone to prepare for the challenges she knew were coming. Crawford's threats hadn't been empty words. She would face increasing pressure from white settlers who disapproved of her choices, and she needed to be ready to defend herself and her decisions. Over the next several weeks, Mary Beth transformed herself from an isolated frontier woman into someone who could stand up to the criticism and hostility she faced from her own community. She practiced her arguments for why her arrangement with Running Wolf was beneficial, rather than dangerous, not just for Thomas but potentially for relations between whites and Comanches in general. She improved her shooting skills with her late husband's rifle, spending hours each day practicing until she could hit targets at distances that would give any potential attackers reason to think twice about approaching her property with violent intentions. She learned more about Comanche customs and beliefs by trading with Mexican families who had lived in the territory longer than the white settlers and had more experience with peaceful coexistence. These conversations helped her understand the world Thomas was experiencing with his father's people, and gave her ammunition to counter the arguments of whites who claimed all Indians were savage and uncivilized. Most importantly, she began reaching out to the few neighbors who might be sympathetic to her situation. Not everyone in the territory was as rigid and hateful in their thinking as Crawford and his followers. There were other settlers who had lost family members to the ongoing conflicts, but still believed that peace was better than endless war. That understanding was preferable to mutual destruction. One of these potential allies was Rebecca Martinez, whose late husband had been a trader who worked with several Indian tribes before his death from pneumonia the previous winter. Rebecca lived alone on a small ranch about 10 miles east of Mary Beth's cabin, and she had a reputation for speaking her mind regardless of what others thought about her opinions. "Girl, you've got more courage than sense," Rebecca told Mary Beth during her first visit to the Martinez ranch. "But that doesn't necessarily mean you're wrong about what you're doing." Rebecca had heard all the gossip from town, had listened to Crawford's version of events with growing skepticism, and had decided to see for herself what kind of woman would risk everything to protect a Comanche child and maintain a relationship with his warrior father. "What you're trying to do," Rebecca continued, pouring coffee that was stronger than anything Mary Beth had tasted in months. "It's not natural by most folks' standards, and it's certainly not safe by anybody's measure. But then again, most folks haven't lived through what you've lived through or seen what you've seen. Do you think I'm making a terrible mistake?" Mary Beth asked honestly, desperate for an opinion from someone who wasn't either completely hostile or completely invested in the outcome. Rebecca considered the question seriously, studying Mary Beth's face as if she could read the truth of the situation in her expression and bearing. "I think you're trying to solve a problem that nobody else has figured out how to solve," she said finally. "I think you're putting that child's welfare ahead of what's convenient or socially acceptable. And I think that takes a kind of strength and wisdom that most people don't possess. But do you think it will actually work?" Mary Beth pressed. "Honey, I don't know," Rebecca replied with brutal honesty. "But I'll tell you what I do know. I've seen what happens when white folks and Indians only know how to hate each other and fight. I've seen the bodies and the burned-out homesteads and the children on both sides who grow up thinking the other side is nothing but demons in human form." Rebecca paused to sip her coffee, her weathered hands steady despite her age. "Maybe what you're doing won't work in the end. Maybe that boy will grow up confused about where he belongs, caught between two worlds and never fully accepted by either one. But maybe," she continued, "just maybe he'll grow up understanding both sides better than anyone ever has before. Maybe he'll be part of the generation that figures out how to live together instead of just killing each other until one side or the other is completely destroyed." The conversation gave Mary Beth hope, but it also reminded her how much pressure Thomas would face as he grew older. He would have to be extraordinarily strong to withstand criticism and suspicion from both communities. He would have to develop his own sense of identity, despite living a life that was different from everyone around him. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles to the north, Running Wolf was discovering his own challenges in implementing their unusual arrangement. Thomas had adapted to traveling and camp life more quickly than anyone expected. His natural Comanche heritage seemed to emerge as soon as he was surrounded by horses, open spaces, and the rhythm of nomadic life that had sustained his people for generati.